streets up. Yeah, yeah. Okay, wake the streets up. Okay, come on. Okay, wake the streets up. Yeah, yeah. Okay.
Everyone, and welcome to the Strategies for Justice Conscious Law Enforcement Forum Series, the Legalities, Policies, and Laws in Times of Injustice. My name is Robeson at Penn State University, and I will be acting as tonight's moderator. As we get started, if you need to call in or ask a question, please do so in the chat function and call in with the number. If either of the panelists need more clarification for your question, our behind the scenes analysts will pop you in so that you can ask the question live. So tonight on the panel, we have Ken Williams, who is a former Boston area homicide detective and expert witness consultant in wrongful death cases. Mr. Williams is retained by civil rights attorneys to evaluate and render unbiased opinions in officer-involved shootings and other deaths. He has appeared as a subject matter expert in print and television media and has been featured as a public speaker at law schools and community forums. Mr. Williams also performs a public service for nonprofits and families in need by providing an unbiased opinion, reviewing waiving fees. Please welcome Mr. Ken Williams.
Thank you for having me.
Our other panelist is Jonathan Newton, who is a former police officer who was wrongfully accused of serious crimes. After this experience, he became a lawyer to fight for justice. Mr. Newton focus on police conduct rights amongst other criminal defenses. Mr. Newton is also a sitting president of the National Association Against Police, whose mission is to eliminate incidents of police brutality through proactive education of citizens, creating public awareness of the issue, and advocating for the National Association Against Police Brutality seeks to create a national standard for use of force, guidelines for accountability for law enforcement personnel. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Newton.
Thanks for having me.
Gentlemen, you tonight, given this is our first time meeting. So I'm excited about what's going to happen tonight. So the first question I have for you is, what are the missions and the actions your organization take during times of injustice?
I guess I can go first. Under the title of Cable Services, I'm a police practices use of force type of expert that is hired by attorneys to oversee, review cases regarding force that was used against citizens, police force that was used against citizens. And I believe it's a very important area for there to be an unbiased position, especially people who are Black, to take in these type of situations to try and promote the greatest amount of fairness across the board with respect to wrongful death type cases. And as a consultancy business, I take it upon myself to be, a person that's in that position, in that chair, to oversee that things are moving along as far as having representation for victims, as well as if there's a police officer, for instance, that is maybe not abusing their training or not committing police brutality, also saying that as well. But in many instances, there are police officers, unfortunately, across America that are abusing their authority and their trust and violating the civil rights of citizens.
Thank you, Ken.
the National Association Against Police Brutality during times of injustice, we pretty much just stick with the same process and procedure that we do even when there are not heightened situations, or should I say, situations like the George Floyd killing. We maintain the same thing. Our primary role is to educate the community so that they can become empowered to seek accountability. And so what we do is that's our primary role. Our other role is we connect victims of police misconduct with legal, spiritual, and wellness help. That's always been what we've done since 2014. We maintain a list of practitioners who practice in the police accountability space. We also advise folks, rather, when they have these situations that happen, we advise families as to what should be some best practices, because a lot of families during these situations are bombarded by lawyers at times. They're bombarded by media, and they're bombarded by activists who come seeking to exploit these situations. And so our primary role has always been educating to empower to seek accountability, but we also have somewhat of a support mechanism for families. And also, we connect victims of police misconduct or alleged police misconduct with legal, spiritual, and wellness help. And we stick with that regardless of what's happening in the national spotlight at the time.
Thank you. So I have a follow-up question specifically for you, Jonathan, based on what your organization does. Mm-hmm. How might someone that you talked about education mm-hmm. of the public? How can we educate? So I work at a university with a lot of college mm-hmm. students who come from major cities where they have disputes and things with police officers. Or students a lot of young people are watching videos where they see people talking about, I know my rights and things of that nature. How can we educate them to help them as well, or some of the educational programs? How can I get some of the educational programs you have to offer to my students here?
The way we work now is we work through online venues of setting up Know Your Rights seminars during COVID. Prior to that, we would go out, or I would go out to either a college or churches, and we'd offer a presentation about knowing your rights. And essentially what we do is we talk about your constitutional rights, but we talk about them in the context of what police officers do during encounters. And so our primary thing is to explain to people we explain to them sort of the process of how a traffic stop works, and also how a foot patrol encounter works. And then we explain to them what are the basis of these stops that have to be met for it to be constitutional, and what to do when you're approached by a cop who's not carrying forth the constitutional requirements that he's mandated to do. So we educate through live demonstrations. We take when I go out and I do them, I do a little miniature test, almost like in a classroom, where we ask folks. A lot of folks are not informed as to what police officers do, but they're also not informed as to what they are required to do. Almost 70% of the people that we poll when we go out don't know that they actually have to get out the car if the officer asks them to get out the car, if it's for officer safety, and he articulates that. And so having that base piece of knowledge stops what I call the fear to fatality cycle from starting up. And so that's how we educate. We try to also train other people so that they can go out and be ambassadors with the training to actually do the exact sort of training that we do, to educate and inform people as to what's the proper etiquette and procedure for traffic stops out of citizens and police alike.
Thank you. We're going to be reaching out. We need that.
Okay.
So my next question then is, why is police misconduct such a difficult topic to discuss in America?
Well, first off, the way that it's presented in America in the national media is that it has been presented in a way that makes it seem as though it only happens to Black and brown people. And so there is a natural there's a natural discrimination that happens when there's an issue that is dealing with Black suffering. We have been America has have built up a tolerance for Black and brown people suffering. So when police misconduct is presented in a narrative that only shows Black and brown people, there becomes a sort of ambivalence to police misconduct. And you will hear this out of some people prior to them understanding that it's larger than it's happening in other communities besides ours. You'll hear people say stuff like, well, they must have done something wrong to deserve that. And so, or they'll say, I know that that's bad, but, and so inside those biases, you're trying to have a conversation about dealing with police misconduct. And it's very difficult in dealing with two issues. One, the bias, and then the actual issue of police misconduct itself.
Thank you. Ken, do you have anything to add?
Well, I mean, law enforcement is built on a system of unequal justice. When we look at the very beginning of law enforcement in America, it was built on control, 100% control by white people controlling 100% of the Black population, and that's the roots of law enforcement in America. When we fast forward to the different phases that law enforcement has entered into, and now it's into this pre-civil rights phase. We talk about, unfortunately, the few bad apples or the few rotten apples in law enforcement, but we never talk about statistically what does that mean when you say a few. Does it mean it's 50%? Does it mean it's 75%? Does it mean it's 20%? And at the same time, when we talk about the few, we don't talk about the accomplices that help the few get away with there being a lack of accountability in law enforcement. So the few have a lot of support in law enforcement, which is a problem. At the same time, law enforcement has an issue with identifying what is systemic discrimination, systemic racism, unequal treatment of Black people versus white people. And there is a lot of data out there that people can go through, whether it's we're talking about the war on drugs, or we're talking about racially profiling citizens. It always comes down to color. So when we talk about implicit bias and we talk about police officers not knowingly or intentionally doing what they do, somehow they knowingly and intentionally stop Black people more than they do white people. Somehow they knowingly and intentionally, in some of these stops, produce a gun on Black people more than they do white people, unarmed citizens. And we can go through a number of different challenges that are in law enforcement with respect to how Black people are treated differently from white people. And until we get to that type of conversation, and then we talk about on the other side of the spectrum, the lack of accountability built into the system, we can't get to solutions.
Good point. Next question. Since I'm on a time limit, what steps are critical for creating policies and laws tailored toward police accountability?
It's important in terms of, there's a legal and a legislative agenda as well as awareness. When I think about what's happening today, with respect to Black Lives Matter movement, a lot of young folks are energized. They see a wrong that's been committed, and they go out and they have an awareness campaign. And at the same time, we're now seeing where legislatively and legally, police reform in many different local jurisdictions is something that's being taken up as law. Something that's going to change policy. It's important for everyone to realize that all three of those have to marry each other. You can't have an awareness campaign that raises awareness but doesn't change the underlying problems legally and legislatively. So the solutions are just kind of like the civil rights movement. There was segregation. There was all of these different acts that were being discrimination based, whether it was in housing, education, jobs, opportunity, All of these things came under an umbrella in the 1964 Civil Rights Act, was the legal and legislative piece after the awareness campaign kicked off that changed things in 1964 going forward, that created more opportunity, that also gave people who were harmed by discrimination in certain activities a right of redress. And it's important for us to continue that practice going forward and understand where we were in the past and how we solved some of these issues and where we need to go in the future to continue to solve them.
Thank you.
For me, I think, and I piggyback on what Kenneth said. One is we have never really had. We've had surveys that take place that are isolated based on a region or a particular town, so that we know that there is racial discrimination that's happening inside law enforcement. The very first step, I believe, so what I mean by examples of that, they had the 2007 New Jersey Turnpike study that was done that showed that 8 out of 10 stops that happened on the New Jersey Turnpike were African Americans. And then we can go year by year, study by study, and we now see that there has been a problem. What we've never done is a real open and transparent inspection of police activity. And that's the beginning. I think that's the genesis. Every department already collects data. That data is not really proactively inspected to see what type of conduct is happening out of officers. During a regular police stop, there will be racial markers that are called out to the dispatch. During a foot encounter, the officer calls out identifiers of the person that he is dealing with in case something goes wrong. Police can know where to start. That information needs to be called and it needs to be looked at and inspected to determine, is this officer in a predominantly white area? Is he only pulling over, or is he only is he only initiating stops with black and brown people? And so I think that the very first step in real police accountability is an open and transparent inspection of what's happening with police interactions. After we do that, we can run algorithms against these that data to determine whether there are aberrations that are happening, and we should be able to do that with every single department in America. When an officer pulls over somebody, he calls out his unit number, and then he tells the dispatcher, I'm dealing with 4 black suspects, black males, white male, whatever. These are markers, identifiers that can be called to determine, is this officer only doing this type of pullover multiple times? And once you get that type of data, then you can move on to the next step, which is, can we come up with policies that curb that conduct? Can we penalize the aberrant behavior? And can we incentivize officers to do the right thing, which is pulling people over not based on race? With the decisions that have come out from the Supreme Court, essentially officers, one of the decisions obviously is the Wren decision. Officers really have nothing that stops them from being subjective and discriminatory when it comes to pulling over citizens. And so that causes the situations that we have to be rubber stamped and increase. And so again, I would say real open and transparent inspection of police activity, led by a proactive inspection of the data to create the policy set that we're talking about implementing.
So we have a question from T.T. Williams. What does actual criminal justice reform look like?
So, that's a mirror. That's
the first part.
Let me.
And the second part is police reform a separate focus from the criminal justice system?
So police reform, to my mind, is the tip of the spear of the criminal justice system. It is the most visible component of a fivefold system, starting with the police, then going to the prosecutors, then going to the judges, then going to the corrections, and then going to probation, right? And police reform is, in my mind, it is something that needs to be dealt with by itself, but with inside of a system that needs to have the exact same type of scrutiny looked at. We need to be looking at the discretionary processes that prosecutors do. We need to be looking at the discretionary decisions that judges make, and it all stems around us not inspecting the criminal justice system. Every system in America that people's lives depend on and that is very critical, we inspect it. You ride on a metro, you ride on an airplane, those systems are proactively inspected to make sure that number one, the mechanics are doing their jobs. Number two, the physical apparatus is not going to fail during a critical mass. In the criminal justice system, it is a closed loop system that inspects itself, okay, and it is only reactionary. It is never proactive. We only deal with situations when we only deal with seeking justice when somebody is suing or something bad has happened. We never are going out looking for bad actors inside the criminal justice system. And that, I believe, needs to change. We need to be looking for bad actors inside the criminal justice system like we look for bad actors inside society.
You know, these are very good questions because, you know, police reform, if we think about the manufacturing of a product, let's say the school to prison pipeline, and we think about the manufacturing of a student that later on becomes embroiled in the criminal justice system. Before all that happens in the criminal justice system, there was a police officer that was on a beat that you know, had something to do with introducing the student into the criminal justice system. So the two systems work hand in hand with each other, but the police officers are the people that have the first contact before the actual criminal justice system looks at through a judge or a jury whether or not a person is going to be adjudicated or not. So police reform, to me, versus criminal justice reform, they can be looked upon as two separate issues. I mean, Black people are looking for what we've always asked for, which is equal opportunity, the same fairness in the justice system that white people experience every single day. If white people were going out and having to experience police brutality at the same statistical rate as Black people, then white people would be, you know, up in arms and protesting and having issues with policing as Black people do. If white people were being racially profiled by Black police officers, the same as white officers are racially profiling Black citizens, then of course, you know, that would show that there was a problem across the board in law enforcement. But, you know, the issues that we're talking about with respect to law enforcement are very systemic as far as color goes. Majority of the police officers in America are white. Majority of them are white and male. And it's imperative that we look at and address the fact that these problems aren't new. The cycle that has repeated itself since the very beginning in the genesis of law enforcement in America to what it is today is it's very important and it's vital where we have 3 Black men on this panel right now. And at the same time, the Black people who are in law enforcement, whether they're male or female, need to start speaking up a little bit more about their personal experiences before they became members of law enforcement. And as they became members of law enforcement, what were those experiences like on the force? Because if we're talking about, you know, police reform, it's going to require whistleblowers from within to talk about what their personal experiences are to marry with the discrimination that the citizens are experiencing in the street, because those two worlds aren't separate. Police officers don't live on Mars, and all the Black people who are being discriminated against live on planet Earth. All groups live here on Earth. And until we have that type of conversation where we also bring in those whistleblowers who are inside the agencies to talk about the negative discriminatory experiences that they experience every single day, and that those experiences match the same experiences that are happening on the outside of those agencies, you know, we're running circles around each other. Those two groups, law enforcement has done a great job as far as trying to go and sell that there is separate, you know, issues here. We have the blue code of silence. We have some people thinking that they're running around Smurfs, that, you know, they're the color blue. No, we each see each other and we identify each other as we see each other. And at the same time, Black communities are being targeted and handled very differently from white communities. So what does criminal justice and what does police reform look like? Police reform has to be about accountability. If there's no accountability for those rogue individuals that are running around and running roughshod on different citizens based on the color of their skin, if there's no accountability, there cannot be any criminal justice in the system that's going to be fair.
Well said.
Thank you. Yes, very well said. So TT has a follow-up question. Um, and I think it goes along with what we were just talking about. So we're going to stay with this question. Discuss problem solving versus reform. And is it separate or are they the same?
I'll go first. I mean, problem solving and reform should be looked at as two different isolated issues. Reform is talking about, from my understanding, from having talked to many different citizens, reform issue is talking about policing as a service. If we think about policing, 80% of what policing is about is social service kind of work, responding to calls after the fact, and 20% of the calls that police respond to are for the crime-related problems. So in terms of reform, a lot of citizens are saying, if police are complaining about the crimes that they can't seem to lower, the statistical type of crimes, the serious violent crimes that they can't seem to lower in communities, a lot of that has to do with because the police officers that are responding to social service type calls, they aren't A, licensed clinician workers, B, because they lack the ability to go and solve those type of crimes, those crimes of poverty, those not crimes, but those issues of poverty, those issues of a school system that's not receiving enough money, the fact that some people are unemployed and that discrimination may be preventing them from being able to become more gainfully employed. That is one separate issue. Discussing the problem-solving part in policing is the matter of how do we, A, solve some of the issues of how police respond to members of the community in a systemically racist system. That's one issue. At the same time, on the flip side, the problem-solving has to be, instead of responding to the same calls for service, not getting a fair and a good outcome, and continuing to repeat that same cycle, how do you solve it so that you don't have to respond to those same calls and actually give people a chance to go and improve and move beyond the system that they're that's negatively impacting their lives? So those are two separate issues to me.
Reform to me is trying to change fundamentally what policing is, whereas problem solving to me it seems that it just has a connotation of being episodic. We're going to deal with an issue rather than deal with the broad spectrum of problems that are that happen inside policing. We've designed policing in America around a monetarily incentivized system, and I think that has been a continuation of the genesis of policing in America. When we started policing in America was to catch runaway slaves. And so what we've done is iteration after iteration, we have made a different terminology for runaway slaves. And it started with slavery, then we said we abolished slavery, but we never really abolished slavery. We just simply changed the qualifications for slavery. And so this idea of policing in America has changed, has basically remained the same concept. And it's been monetarily incentivized control of people. And so I think we need to fundamentally redefine what we call policing in America. Policing implies that we go out and actually are stopping something bad from happening in a community, where realistically what we're doing with policing in America as it is now is we are reacting to situations that occur after the fact. And if we look at policing and withdraw some of the activities that policing is being targeted to doing, and really focus them on what I believe should be their role, I think that we would have better outcomes. We would have less encounters for things that are really not beneficial for society. We have policing in D.C. that goes around and shakes people down over minor drug possession charges. When I say minor drug possession, marijuana charges, what they call, trespassing, sitting out in front of somebody's business. That's not trespassing. That's just somebody standing around outside of a business. And so we have police that have been tasked with doing that type of activity, and they create all of these interactions that drive a wedge further between the community, so that when something really bad happens, the community is not feeling any way connected to the policing agencies that are tasked with now finding the perpetrator of something that is really bad that has happened inside a community. And so, like up in New York with broken windows really drove a wedge between the community and police. And so when stuff that really bad happens, nobody wants to talk to the police. And so we need to fundamentally look at changing what policing is in our communities and in our country.
Thank you both. That was very insightful. We have a question from a caller. Michael, you there?
Over wedge between the community and police. And so when stuff that really bad happens, nobody wants to talk to the police. And so we need to fundamentally what policing is.
I don't think that's Michael.
Sounds like me.
My name's Michael.
Yeah.
And,
There we go.
Address this question to both of you. First of all, I'm glad you guys are having this forum. Recently, 3 minor African American youths were handcuffed by 2 white cops in Inglewood, California, for jaywalking. The cops ran their name to a warrant and logged their names. I think that was heavy-handed for such a minor infraction. What do both of you think? And is there any recourse for these 3 youths?
I think, in terms of policing, police officers, in order to go and justify a stop, I'm not sure if there's feedback.
I think it's just the recording is playing back.
Okay.
Can we stop that, Mr. Watson?
Okay. I think there are things that we have to separate. The purpose of the stop, jaywalking, a relatively low crime that doesn't usually involve people who are dangerous or anything like that. They're walking in the middle of the road or causing a danger to themselves mostly. So the type of stop is one issue. The fact that they're minors is another issue. But let's say, for instance, the stop is valid, because it doesn't take a lot for police officers to have a valid stop. Mm-hmm. So let's assume the stop is valid. They're jaywalking, and now in many jurisdictions, not only do people see the law enforcement officers stop a child or a citizen. Sometimes they see them handcuff them. Sometimes they see them direct them to sit on a curb, on a sidewalk. Predominantly, it's Black people that these type of stops occur. And if it were my son or my daughter that was being stopped by the police, I would hope that they would treat my son or daughter the same as I would treat theirs if I were involved in a stop of their loved one or family member. But we understand that does not occur. So there's a thing that I like to go and talk about that happens in law enforcement, which happens to be what's called overzealous policing. Taking a community, especially poor members of the community that are poor, and having an overzealous type of policing presence in these communities. Just because you're poor doesn't mean that you're a criminal, but there are a lot of police officers that treat people who are poor as if they're committing crimes from being poor. And if you're a person of color and you're poor, that even exacerbates the problem. So no, it should not be okay for kids who are walking down a street to be subjected to a Terry stop, which is a stop, question, and frisk. It's not okay, for instance, children and adults in Ferguson who are being treated as human ATMs in that particular jurisdiction, where almost 80 to 90% of the people who were Black in that community had warrants against them in the penal system, the criminal justice system, and the police system inside that one jurisdiction was using Black people as a human ATM to fund their jobs. And that's what it ultimately comes down to when I see these type of things that happen. Police officers that are going out, committing these overzealous policing actions in Black communities, predominantly Black communities, mostly Black communities, are doing it because A, the leadership that is from the chief down permits them to do it, and they do it with impunity. And also, they have unions, police unions, that protect them when they do get caught out there with, like Jonathan said earlier, where a police officer goes out with his overzealous policing and stops and frisks, 50 black people in a shift to try to see if he or she can find one person that might have a crime that's being committed, and the other 49 people who were stopped and frisked and questioned by police hadn't done anything. That's something that played out in New York City, where millions upon millions of people who were black and brown citizens were stopped, questioned, and frisked simply for a quota system, and also as a shakedown in overzealous policing. And we have to go and stop that in America.
For me, I echo what Ken is saying in terms of do I think that it was the caller asked the question, do I think that it was justifiable without knowing more, but also just without knowing more, I couldn't say, but just knowing how it's done typically, I can pretty much say with confidence that you rarely see this type of conduct done in other communities. You primarily see it done only in black and brown communities. For me, I would be analyzing the basis of the stop. Was it really jaywalking? Were they really outside of marked areas that they could walk across the street? Oftentimes what an officer calls jaywalking or what an officer calls trespassing it doesn't meet the legal definition of that particular crime. And so they just throw out this broad term. I stopped him for jaywalking. That becomes a basis for them to make a stop, a pretextual stop. I just want to, I want to, if these officers want to do something, they have to legally justify it. And that decision in Wren gives them a basis to do that. Now, the use of force of handcuffs, and it is a preventative use of force, but it is a use of force, right? We rarely see that level of force used on white subjects, right? We often see it with black and brown youth. And the question is will there be any recourse that they can get? Legally speaking, most of the time there is going to be none. And the reason is because the law that allows the conduct is so broad and amorphous that it doesn't penalize the conduct unless there is a patent and blatant violation of their constitutional rights. And so when you look at, number one, was the stop legitimate, right? Was there really a basis for them to be stopped for quote unquote jaywalking? Then if there was that use of force handcuffing? Was there anything that was articulated in their statement of probable cause that would say that an officer is justified in using handcuffs on this subject? Oftentimes, they don't even put any statement whatsoever about why they put handcuffs on people. They just simply gloss over the fact and they say, we detained the subject. They don't even mention the fact that these individuals were handcuffed while they were being detained. And so, glossing over it that way, is, in my opinion, it's a false report because it doesn't report the use of force, right? Could there be criminal prosecution for that? There should be, but is there? Oftentimes not. So the officer writes down that we detain these subjects. They don't go into the level of specificity to tell their supervisors, we detain these people, but we also put handcuffs on them. So the public, the supervisors don't know. And then often, even when the supervisors do know, they rubber stamp it anyway. And so there's no reason to handcuff people when there's not a threat of physical harm. When an officer doesn't feel, that he's in jeopardy. And during a detention, I don't know about you, Ken, but I didn't handcuff people when I was simply talking to them. Oftentimes if there was somebody that was larger than me, I'd ask them, do they mind if I pat them down? If there was something that I actually felt that there was going to be a physical confrontation. But you have a lot of people that are in policing that have no business policing black and brown communities because they have no real connection to the communities, and they have all of these implicit biases and irrational fears when it comes to dealing with black and brown people.
I mean, I think it's also important for us to talk about.
I asked them, do they mind if I pat them down? If there was something that I actually felt
that there was going to be a physical confrontation. But you have a lot of people that are in policing.
That's Jonathan's answer again.
Business policing black and brown because they have no real connection. And they have all these biases and irrational fears when it comes to dealing with black and brown people.
Yeah, I think.
Yeah, they did a good job answering the question, definitely. But these guys crossed against the light. That's what happened.
Right. So you're talking about a low level offense, if anything, and at the same time, we're talking about, does it rise to the level where, you know, police officers can do what they do? And fortunately, in policing, there's this word that gets thrown around out there that's called discretion. And, you know, the discretion that police officers have is vast. You know, what Jonathan just spoke about, which was very important, is when it rises to the level of it becoming a detention to a seizure to while the person's in custody, potentially there's an excessive force, there's a Fourth Amendment and a constitutional issue. Now we're rising to the level where qualified immunity is in jeopardy for that police officer based on their conduct and actions as they exercise authority over a citizen. At the same time, if we think about the First Amendment, the officer's speech and their conduct in trying to go and stop the citizen, if the officer's conduct, speech, actions can sometimes be looked upon and viewed upon as an administrative violation, may not even be a civil or a criminal matter. Administratively, they're violating a policy, a training. They could be held accountable administratively and lose their job potentially. You know, they could be fired for those type of things. Now, as Jonathan stated earlier, the problem, of course, is, yeah, we have all of these great things, these great tools that law enforcement has at the very present to hold law enforcement officers accountable. Trying to find how many officers were held accountable using those great tools, you're going to find it's very rare, unfortunately.
Thank you, Michael. Great question and good answers from Ken and Jonathan. I want to have another question here. So actually, before we get to that question, Ken, you said something that struck me with the administrative leave, because I don't know if you've seen it, but I seen a video recently of a black man sitting in his car, and the officer opens his door, unhooks his seatbelt, pulls him out. And before he pulls him out of the car, the gentleman, the black gentleman, tells him he is recording this. And the police officer looks into the camera and says, "Watch this or enjoy the show."
I saw that one too.
Yeah, I mean, you know, that is a prime example of, you know, the stop could have been valid. I mean, I believe the initial officer stopped the car based on an inspection sticker that had expired. It's a valid stop. No issues there. Once the stop occurred, it was a female officer that called for backup because she thought that she may have smelled the odor of marijuana coming from the vehicle. In that particular jurisdiction, if the officer smells the odor or sees contraband inside the vehicle, the driver can be ordered out of the vehicle. And in this particular case, when the backup officer arrived with his partner, they're on video. This officer is having a conversation with the driver. The driver isn't aware of the law. He's not aware of the law. The officer's ordering him out of the vehicle, and that's fine, you know, because the officer has the right to do so based on that law and that particular jurisdiction. But what that officer cannot do is then all of a sudden start to tell that citizen by threat that if they do not comply, I believe he said something to the effect that everyone was about to witness an ass whooping that they have never seen before, which, you know, would trigger, if I were the driver, if I were the operator of the vehicle, and I'm telling the officer, hey, I don't feel comfortable, you know, getting out of my car because I fear that you might harm me. And now all of a sudden you're talking about giving me an ass whooping. And then once I'm pulled out of the car by chokehold, you're engaging in an ass whooping. I think that my fear was confirmed. And, you know, that particular officer shouldn't just face an administrative termination, you know, based on what I saw. There should be some criminal charges that should be brought up against that officer for excessive force, constitutional violations of that citizen, a Fourth Amendment situation, which, you know, was excessive. based on what I saw in that video.
Thank you. So, what are unique cases you have seen or been a part of that exemplifies the need for stronger legislation to decrease police criminology?
For me, I'm involved in a litigation now with suing a small municipality here in Prince George's County that started with my client essentially being charged with traffic violations that were frivolous, and then he was subjected to being pepper sprayed while he was handcuffed in the car. And when I started doing my initial look into this police department, there were some things that stood out to me that were out of place, and it became what I consider to be a stereotypical small police department, which is there's very little accountability. There's very little funding that is involved with that police department. So they hire from the bottom of the barrel. They hire often officers who are rejects from other departments. Subsequently, looking into this particular police department, I was going to serve the papers on the agency because I didn't use a process server with this, and the officer he sort of confronted me. The police department has subsequently lost the police chief resigned. Another officer there at that police department is up on charges for raping a woman at the police station. And the subject of my lawsuit is being investigated for violations at the state level in terms of constitutionally under the Maryland Declaration of Rights, and also the feds are beginning to look at him now. So with just some small minor inspection, you can find oftentimes situations that are just rancid with corruption, particularly in the small police departments. So that's one that I'm in now. Oh, there's another one that's down in Georgia. I have two. Well, this particular sheriff down in Georgia likes to put people in a restraint chair, Ken, just for making him upset. And so they put people in restraint chairs. He stripped them of their clothes and put them in under suicide watch with no basis for doing that. There was one guy who came forward, and then shortly after the one guy came forward, I have two clients that are down there in Clayton County, Georgia. We'll be filing that particular lawsuit probably within the next 30 days. But this stuff happens because there is no systems of proactive inspection. Even the officers, the correctional officers who work inside this place, some of them want to tell about what's going on, but there really is no system to be able to allow them to come forward in an anonymous fashion to report something that's going on and get a response that will actually cause people to come in and start looking at some of these activities. And that goes for these correctional, for these lockups, and it goes for these small police agencies as well. Ken will tell you he faced hell when he came forward as a whistleblower. I faced hell when I came forward as a whistleblower. And that's because there's no systems to allow us to come forward. When you come forward, you have made the determination that I'm going to lose my job. I am probably going to you may face some criminal prosecution, and you have talked about, or you have at least thought about protecting your life, because there are situations in certain jurisdictions where officers have been physically threatened with harm, and some have had their lives attempted to be killed. And so the Serpico story is just one story, but there are many others that have had their lives threatened.
I know for me, before I joined the rank and file of policing, as a black man in America, I understood, based on my own personal experiences, that policing was deeply entrenched with how it interacted with members of the black community compared to how it interacted with members of the white community, and that those two were not equal. I joined law enforcement back in 1995 with my eyes wide open, understanding that there could be, most likely, I would have to face some issues and stuff. But I thought that, maybe I could be one of the people that could change things based on my presence being in law enforcement. And, in my career, I found out that it didn't make a difference, that I was there. that people who were hell-bent on doing things, they were part of a system that would protect them. And that system, works like a well-greased wheel that goes all the way up to from the top down. When you're talking about law enforcement officers are protected by taxpayers in a community, and that those communities are, millions of dollars that are, being brought into the coffers of those communities. When you look at the way that this thing works, a police officer, for instance, a cop tries to report what it may be misconduct within internally. They don't have any First Amendment protections doing that right now in America. If you go and you report on another officer, you're doing your job according to the courts. So there's no First Amendment protections there. But now that you've exposed yourself to other officers, like Jonathan said, you're going to face retaliation for doing that, because now no one's going to want to go and work with you. You're going to feel isolation. And if you're a black person, as Jonathan's talking about, or in some instances, if you're a female police officer, you can probably count the days that are numbered before you're gone.
Yeah.
And that's the problem with law enforcement. There are a lot of good cops that are former cops and stuff like that, and there are a lot of horrible cops that are former cops. But at the same time, the system has gone above and beyond to protect the actions of those rogue individuals in uniform. And that is because at the administrative level, the cities have a conflict of interest. They're trying to protect the city coffers from a lawsuit. So they do their best to make sure that they provide a defense for that officer. At the administrative level and investigative level at the police agency, there's a conflict of interest because the Internal Affairs Department works with the cop that's being investigated. So that's an issue as well. So when you look at all of these pieces that are moving together and they're trying to protect each other under the same umbrella, it's very, very difficult, unless you have someone from the inside that helps to corroborate what the witness is saying from the outside that's been harmed.
Wow. That so with what you both just said, so the system that was created with all of the things that you have talked about tonight is working just fine. It's a well-oiled machine built around the protection of the folks that within that machine to harm the people that are outside of there and that they don't allow in. We are coming up close to the end of our hour. So before we do, I want to know if there are any other questions from the audience before I wrap up with one last question for each of our panelists. So this person just trying to get faces straight before I really keep following. I like to know who I am following. All right. So I don't know what you're seeing on your computer screen. We each have our names there. Ken Williams is a former Boston homicide detective, and Jonathan is the National Association Against Police Brutality. Is that right?
Yes.
Chairman, as well as an attorney. And you can see all of our names. And my name is Carlos Wiley, and I'm the director of the Paul Robeson Cultural Center at Penn State University. And so my last question for you two tonight is, what message do you have to America around police brutality?
For me, it's time to move from marching to action. And what I mean by that is looking at your local government first. Find ways that you can begin to push policies that will begin to get accountability, or at least curb conduct that creates misconduct. What I mean by that is policies that we have a 20-point policy platform that's on our website at naapb.org. These are 20 policy demands that we are pushing to get folks to understand that these policies are what I call best practices for any police department in the country. And so your local government has more chance of passing these policies than the federal government does of passing some broad, sweeping police reform bill. In fact, after every single one of these episodes that we see nationwide, there has been some push to create either a federal response or federal legislation to deal with police misconduct. And the federal government is not the best source to begin to deal with this because policing is a state function. Okay. And so I am asking folks to really begin to interact with your local politicians, your local elected leaders, your local state legislators to begin to look at policies that can change policing. In Maryland, there's the Police Officers Bill of Rights that grants police officers extra protections and extra time to respond to things that are when bad situations happen. We need to begin to work to repeal these extra protections because what is happening is giving a license to officers to do things that are against any sound judgment. And so our 20 policies and 20 point policy demand platform is up on our website. Our message is it's time to move from talking about it, texting about it, to actual move to action and is implementing policy at the local and state level.
Thank you, Jonathan.
I think I would add to that, well said, Jonathan. I think what I would add to that is that in order for policing to change in America, because policing at the jurisdictional level is based on contracts, and the contracts that police unions have been able to have passed afford their members extraordinary protections from having themselves held accountable. And whenever you have a system that has that type of protection, it's about time, I think, for some municipalities to look at the taxpayers and say, look, we screwed up in affording these type of protections to these police renegades that are out here, committing these type of acts, which are costing you, the taxpayers, a lot of money when they get caught in, the case like Jonathan's talking about where there are trials and, potentially settlements and stuff. In certain places like Los Angeles Police Department, in a decade, we're talking about billions of dollars that have been expended in settlements. New York City, billions of dollars. Chicago Police Department just recently in their FY budget allocated $257 million to go towards settlements in a fiscal year. So when we're talking about these type of egregious acts that are being facilitated and protected by the agencies as well as the contracts, it's now time that people start thinking about how do we break the contract, because it's not something that people can, with the ordinary citizen that's out there making $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 a year that's supporting this type of system can't continue to pay high taxes on their properties, can't continue to pay high taxes on their excise tax to go and fund this broken system. Breaking the contract is important. And that's what occurred in New Jersey recently, where one police agency, because of the corruption being so steep and so costly to the citizens, they ended up having to break the contract by defunding the entire police agency and starting all over again with new contracts, which afforded them better ways to go and hold officers accountable. And that's something that we should think about across the country. And the other thing that I want to say is that by holding police accountable, another area that people should be concentrating on is professional liability insurance.
Yes.
Tethering, professional insurance to the individual officer and make the individual officer pay for their own insurance. Bring a third-party insurer in the mix to assess whether or not that police officer is going out and committing some bad acts. And if their insurance gets jacked up where, after so many, types of actions and misconducts that they're involved in, maybe tie their job to their lack of being insurable. Also, the officers that, work around that officer and promote that type of activity, jack up their insurances as well, and that'll break the blue code of silence.
Wow. That last one, Ken, I never thought about that. But I want to thank both of you on behalf of I'm going to read Michael Jones's comment because it kind of goes with what I was about to say. So he said, we need former officers such as yourselves to be consultants to determine excessive force, which can you do already. And I just wanted to say thank you to both of you on behalf of Strategies for Justice and joining us tonight. I know for myself, you've given me a lot of things to think about and talk about with folks that I know that are out there doing work, pushing to local municipalities, both on the city level, I believe, and as well as the state level. I think some state legislators can also help us create some policies and changes that will affect policing. But again, I want to thank both of you. I appreciate what you did as police officers and what you're currently doing for our community and trying to make it better for us when it comes to policing as Black and brown folks in America. So thank you both very much, and we'll catch everyone next time.
Thanks for having me. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.